when I was at uni, which was obviously a long time ago, I had to take cell physiology in third year. And I say I had to take because no one wanted to take cell physiology in third year. The lecturer was 137 years old. And everyone knew, because we'd had him a bit in second year, everyone knew that the guy had no idea what he was talking about. He was really old, and so no one took his class by choice. But there was a small group of us, I think it was like 8 in the class, people who just, because of the major that we were doing and the way courses lined up, we just had to take that course. And I kid you not, those 8 of us, we would, after every lecture we had with this guy, we would book a tutorial room, and we would the whole class, the whole 8 of us, would go into the tutorial room, try and compare notes and try and help each other understand what the heck just happened in the previous 50 minutes. It was that bad. The lecturer just was unclear and old. Did I mention he was old? Anyway, I did a major assignment at the end of that year on photosynthesis, which was his sort of area of expertise, and we talked a lot about that. And I remember sitting in the Flinders Uni Library with a whole stack of old scientific journals on my desk, because I went to uni at a time when you actually read books with paper pages in them. I know this is a weird thing for you. Actually had real books. And I'm digging through all this, trying to go sort of as far back in the literature as I can to understand this stuff. And then it strikes me that as I'm reading through the references from these old papers from the 50s and 60s, I see the name of the author on all these really critical papers in the area. And the name of the author is A.B. Hope. That's actually him. He's dead now, but that's actually him. My 137-year-old professor, who we thought didn't understand this stuff, it turned out he was the guy that discovered this stuff. Yeah. No, he was not 130. Dude. What do they say? You can choose your friends, you can't choose your family. It turns out that this old guy that we all sat in his lectures and we thought he had no idea what he's talking about. He turned out to be the guy that started this whole area of research decades and decades before. You ever been there? Ever had that sort of experience where you've looked at an old person or an old thought or an old idea and it seems to you to be totally boring, totally irrelevant, totally, kind of disconnected from the current reality. But as you look more closely at it, you discover that it's actually really good. It's actually really important. It's actually really relevant to right where you are today. Sometimes people feel like this when they meet old people. They look at old people and they're deaf and they dress funny and they smell even worse. But when you all know this. Hey, don't look at me. You all know this. Not you, Steve, other old people. But when you get to know them, you sit with these people and you start to hear these stories and you realise they're fantastic human beings, right? You know that feeling? Old technology, you look at some of these old machines. Every now and then I get dragged to a museum and you look at some of these old machines and they appear to be clunky and slow and huge. And then you start reading what people managed to do with some of this old technology and you go, it was amazing. I don't know if you've seen a film like Hidden Figures or The Imitation Game, and you look at what people did with some of it and you go, wow. For the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at a 2,000-year-old message or sermon. Was given in one of the very first churches, one of the very first Christian churches that ever there was, over 2,000 years ago. We call it the book of Hebrews in our Bible, and we've spent about 4 or so weeks looking through that, and we've been honest and said it's a really complicated, long, difficult read, and to be honest, lots of parts of it seem pretty boring. But as we've dug, the more we've kind of dug into it, and people have been saying to me, people who come here regularly have been saying, the more we've dug into this, it's been really good. I've really learned some things, and we've said all along that if you could summarise the book of Hebrews in a sentence, you might say that Jesus is the greatest of all time. The whole book is about how awesome Jesus is. In fact, we've been saying, we've shortened it and said, Jesus is the GOAT, greatest of all time. That's sort of been the theme running through our sort of series. And we did that before Christmas because now we're back where it all began, right? That's what Christmas is, right? It's the beginning of the story. And I don't know if you've ever had this thought, but I have, like, when you think about it, like, Christmas is a weird story. You know, it's a weird story about two nobodies in the middle of nowhere that have a baby in the most bizarre of circumstances. And then somehow that baby somehow changes the world. It's a weird story, right? No one was writing down the story of the first Christmas. No one knew it was happening. No one cared. But somewhere between probably 50 and 70 years after the death of Jesus, a guy called Luke went back and put together the story of Jesus' life. Luke was a doctor, so he was a smart, educated man in a time in the world when lots of people were not educated at all. He was a smart, educated man. And by 50 to 70, like after Jesus, 50 to 70 years after Jesus, lots of the original eyewitnesses, the people that were actually there with Jesus and lived and heard him, they were starting to get old and die. That's what happens, you know. And Luke wanted to make sure that their original stories, the original stories from the people that were actually there, they didn't get lost. And so he took it upon himself to research and to gather these stories into one central story, the biography, the life of Jesus. He actually starts his own biography in the book of Luke, chapter 1, verse 3. This is what he says. He says, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and I decided to write an orderly account for you. In other words, I've put this all into a nice, clear order so we can track the life of Jesus. He says, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. You know, these stories you're hearing, the bits of information you hear about Jesus, I want you to be able to see it all in context and really understand the way this whole picture goes together. So Luke did a kind of a research project on the life of Jesus. He interviewed people who were there, and most scholars believe that he almost certainly interviewed Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so Luke's got the most detailed account of the birth of Jesus. Christy read it to us before, but in part it says that Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth, which was where he lived in an area called Galilee, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. There's a whole backstory about how Joseph was forced to make that journey with his pregnant wife, and his wife was pregnant, but not by him. That's another whole kind of backstory. And while they were there, verse 6, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and she laid him in a manger. A manger was, we don't use the word now, it was a trough where they put food for animals. I don't know what you think a manger looks like on the Christmas cards, but this is what it actually probably looked like. This is a manger that exists today but has been dated from back around the time of Jesus. This is probably, it wasn't a nice wooden triangular thing, though. It was almost certainly a chunk of stone, you know, kind of carved out in the top. That's what a manger looked like. Because you know kind of the story, when they get to Bethlehem, all the accommodation is booked out. And so this whole story happens in the shed at the back of the motel, because the rooms in the motel are booked out. Verse 8, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, so literally on the outskirts of the town, up on the hills, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Which is surely the biggest understatement in this story, right? They were more than terrified. But the angel said to them, don't be afraid, I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. For today in the town of David, which was another name for the town of Bethlehem, for today in the town of Bethlehem, a Saviour has been born to you. He's the Messiah, the Lord. And this will be a sign. In other words, this is how you'll know it's the right baby. You'll find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. when we talk about Christmas, we often talk about the birth of a baby, because that's the sort of picture, right? It was a baby in a manger. But did you notice that that's not actually how the angels announced the news? Did you notice that when the angels surprised a group of shepherds on a hillside, they said, "A Saviour has been born"? We don't use the word saviour much. Usually when we do use the word saviour, it's sort of as a bit of a joke. You know, someone brings you an ice cream at the beach on a hot day and you say, "Oh, thank you, you're my saviour." You know, the RAA gets your car started in the middle of the night and you say, "Oh, the RAA guy was my saviour," like that. What did the angels actually mean when they said Jesus is our saviour? Because after all, he was a baby who hadn't saved anything. How did they know he was going to save anything? What was he going to save? Matthew was one of the original followers of Jesus. He was there right around Jesus. He wasn't at the birth, but he'd obviously heard the stories, you know, family gatherings and things like that around Jesus. He'd heard the stories. He says this is in Matthew 1, chapter 1, verse 21. He said, talking about Mary, "Mary will give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus, because he will save people from their sins." The actual name Jesus in Hebrew, which is the language that Jesus spoke, the name Jesus means the Lord saves. So he's given the name Saviour, essentially. He's given the name Saviour, and he says we're giving him the name Saviour because he's going to save people from their sins. Sin's another word we don't use much, isn't it? When we do, we usually think about the really bad stuff that people do, like murder. You know, that's a sin. Child slavery, right? That's a sin. Barracking for Port Adelaide, you know. Yeah. But this is not how the writers of the Bible thought about the word sin. When the writers of the Bible use the word sin, they're thinking about anything that isn't God's idea of how life should be. They're thinking a sin is anything that isn't God's idea of how life should be. So, sure, it includes things like murder and slavery, but it also includes things like selfishness and greed, using other people to get what you want, things like lying and stealing and gossip. We might kind of say, well, they're bad, but they're not kind of that bad, are they? All those things would be lumped under the word sin. God created people for love and joy and peace and kindness and goodness. God created humanity to serve others before they served themselves. God created people to enjoy him and to connect with him and to be in relationship with him. And so any time we're not living the way that God created us to be, we're in this state that the writers of the Bible call sin. Now I get it, some of you might be thinking that seems a little bit harsh, Matt. I mean, if that's the definition of sin that we're using, then we would all be sinners, right? Because who would measure up to that kind of definition of things? I mean, no one's perfect. Matt, you're obvious. I don't know you well, but Matt, surely you're not perfect either. And I want to say that's exactly the point that the writers are trying to make. That no one is perfect, that we are all in that sense sinful, even on our best days, even on those days when you say, I was awesome today, I was a great husband or wife today, I was a perfect child today, I was so good at work today. Even in those days, we're still stuck in sin. Hundreds, maybe thousands of years before Jesus was born, a poet wrote this in Psalm 14:3, that all have turned away. They have together become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. Paul was one of the early Christian leaders. He knew Luke. He wrote it this way in Romans 3:23 when he said, all have sinned All have sinned and fall short of the glory, the kind of the standard, the wonder, the awesomeness of God. Another early Christian leader called John, 1 John 1:8 says, if we say we have no sin, if we start to think, you know what, I'm doing all right, this sin thing, it's other people, it's not me. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. We're liars. We're all stuck in this idea of sin, and no matter how hard we try, we can't get out of it. And God knows that too. And so going back thousands of years before Jesus, people knew that, and people were waiting for God. They believed that God was going to do something about their sin problem. They believed that God loved them and God wanted good for them, and so He was going to do something about sin. People were waiting for a Saviour. So it doesn't say it in the story, but almost certainly when the angels appeared and said, a Saviour is born, the shepherds were thinking, could this be it? Could this be the one? We've heard the stories, our parents and our grandparents have told us the stories. The shepherds weren't thinking baby. The shepherds were thinking a Saviour. The shepherds were thinking, could this be the one that could come and fix my sin problem and everyone else's sin problem? And it is true to say, that's actually what the first Christmas is all about. But I want to be honest, here's where the story gets a bit tricky for us. Because most people in Australia in the 21st century don't believe they have a sin problem. Most of us don't believe we have a sin problem, and therefore most of us don't believe that we need a Saviour. And so a bit like me sitting in self-physiology, the whole story seems a little bit boring and irrelevant because it doesn't relate to me. This has got nothing to do with me. We live in a world that says, no one's perfect, Matt. We all make mistakes, but that's okay, right? I mean, do the best you can. If you can do more good things than bad things in life, then you'll be okay, right? That's a good sort of way to measure goodness, isn't it? Make sure that there's more good coming out of you than bad. We'll leave the sin thing for murders and rapists and drug dealers and that sort of stuff. And some might even say, actually, Matt, talking to me like I'm a sinner, it actually feels a little bit judgy to me. This whole thing feels a little bit kind of judgmental, because remember, Matt, you're not perfect either. And the quick and obvious answer, just in case you are thinking that, is, heck yeah, I'm not perfect either. I'm a sinner and you're a sinner. That's the picture, right? We're all broken, we all fail, we all sin. Even on our best days, even on my best days, I'm not that good. Not really. And no matter how hard I try, no matter how hard you try, no matter how hard we try, no matter how many good things we do, no matter how many nice things we do, we can never dig ourselves out of the sin mess that we've got ourselves into. Christmas is the story of God's rescue mission. Christmas is the moment when God shows up in history and says, I see your mess, I know your mess, but I love you anyway. In fact, I love you so much that I'm sending a Saviour to rescue you out of the mess that you're in. That's what the angel meant when the angel said, I've got good news, I bring good news that will cause great joy for all people. A Saviour has been born for you. If you're part of all people, I'm a part of all people. If you're a part of all people, then Christmas is good news for you. A Saviour has been born. A Saviour has been born to save us, to save me, and to save you from our sin. Now, I don't know how you kind of process that, but for me, that leaves me with two questions. Question number one, do I agree that I'm a sinner and need saving? And question number two, do I think that Jesus is the Saviour that I need to do the saving, right? Do you agree that you're a mess? Do you agree that you fail? Do we agree that you're stuck in this sin boat, the same sin boat with everyone else, no matter how good or bad you think you are compared to the person sitting next to you? Don't look at the person sitting next to you, particularly those of you who are sitting next to your partner. But friends, for 2,000 years, the Christian message has been that the whole purpose for the life of Jesus, the whole purpose for the whole baby in the manger and the baby growing up has been to fix our sin problem, to fix the world's sin problem. That's the only reason the baby came in the first place. That Jesus did this by sacrificing himself. That's the Easter bit. That's how the Easter and Christmas stories connect. He did this by sacrificing himself, by giving his life. It's the whole death on the cross business. It says that when he died on the cross in that moment, somehow, in a way that we never quite understand, but somehow in that moment, he soaks into himself all of the sin and mess of all people of all time. So not just the people of that time who were standing there, but the people before then, the people after then, the people, you and me today. Somehow like a sponge, he kind of sucks into himself all of the sin and death, and it dies with him. And 3 days later, when he rises back to life in the greatest miracle of all time for sure, in that moment, he overcomes death, but he also overcomes sin. So that then anyone who sort of believes in him, in other words, anyone who kind of joins him, has the ability themselves to overcome death and overcome sin through him. Does that make sense? It kind of doesn't track very well for us, but this is the message of Christianity. And that therefore those who would say yes to Jesus in that way can live a life of peace and joy and love and abundance and goodness. Not because we're any better than the people sitting next to us, but because of what Jesus has done for us, because of the way he has saved us. But it's a choice. It's my choice or your choice as to what we do with those two questions. Because the truth is, you can walk out of here and you can keep doing life your way. You can make your own decisions. You could do what seems right to you. You know, be your own boss, chart your own course. I mean, that's kind of the way life works and the way most of us live. Or you can say yes to Jesus and choose to do life his way. You can allow him to free you from your sin. You can allow him to lead your life. You can sort of say in a very deliberate way, you know what, you can be the boss of my life and I will follow your way of doing things rather than my way of doing things. And that's the choice that all humanity, that all people have to make. And in some ways, that's the choice that Christmas should sort of be nudging us toward. Now, I just want to say as I close, you might be thinking, this sounds like about how do we know this stuff is true? And honestly, that's a great question. It's a question that I've asked myself and probably lots of people have asked themselves in different times. I want to say for me, there are two things that convince me that this is true. The first is to believe the people who were there in the first place. And the second for me is to experience Jesus for myself. Because I've had moments in my life that I can't quite explain where I've experienced something of Jesus in a really real way. I've felt stuff, I've experienced stuff, I've heard stuff, not audible stuff, but it's so loud inside me, it might as well be audible. Yeah, I had that sort of thing. I know some of you had that sort of thing. I've experienced things that have got me to a place where I say, there's got to be something in this, right? This thing has to be true in some way. This is more than coincidence. But more importantly, I believe Luke and Matthew and the other people that were there. Now, here's the way I think about it. This might not make sense to you, but this is the way my brain works. Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus was a nobody? right? He was a nobody from a tiny, like little kind of backwater. He died young, maybe 33 years old. And when he died, at that moment, he had exactly 0 followers in the moment of his death. Did you know that? Everybody ran. I mean, think about it. No one wants to stand next to a bloke who's being executed and says, I'm with him, right? Everyone was like, nothing to do with this guy, let me out of here, and they ran. Jesus died with no followers, with no money, with no books, no profile. He didn't even have an Instagram account. Jesus got cancelled before getting cancelled was a thing, right? But something happened after the resurrection. After Jesus came back to life, something happened that made this whole story so real for the people who were there, so real and so true for the people who were there, that it changed their lives forever. They were so certain, they became so certain of who this Jesus was and what he'd done for them, that they couldn't help but talk to other people about it. So certain were they that even when people who didn't like what they were saying threatened them, even when people literally started killing them, actually killing them, they wouldn't stop talking about it. They told everyone they can, and Jesus went from 0 followers and 0 profile and 0 everything to all of a sudden having tens and then hundreds and then thousands of people who listened to the stories and convinced other people just by telling the stories of what they'd actually seen and actually heard that this thing was true. And then those people were so convinced by that and by the things that they experienced themselves that they told other people, and they told the next generation, and they told the neighbouring town, and they told their next generation. Do you see where this goes? That's how we come to be here today. Have you ever thought about that? Why would they risk their lives to talk about something that was a lie? No one would do that, right? No one would do that. How did the Jesus story survive 2,000 years so that we're talking about it today? It survived because it was true. Does that make sense? So for me, I believe because of the things that I experience, and I believe the people who were there. That's the Christmas story. And now you get to decide what you're going to do in this generation with that story.